Bugango County in Isinjiro District, southwest of the country, is a vast expanse of verdant revolving hills that seem to touch the horizon. To the south, the hills rise and fall into Tanzania, and farthest to the west into Rwanda. Until 1894, when present-day Uganda became a British protectorate under the Imperial British East Africa Company, this territory, stretching farthest south past the river Kagera into northern Tanganyika, was part of Buganda Kingdom. From about the 1790s, River Kagera effectively acted as the boundary between Uganda and the smaller kingdoms of Karagwe, Uzinja, and Kiziba in Tanganyika. The kingdom still paid allegiance to Uganda through the king's representative seated in present-day Masaka, the capital of the Voodoo region. The kindred spirit that existed amongst the communities around here continued in the years that followed until 1890, when Great Britain and Germany, which took over Tanganyika following the Berlin Conference of 1884, started fast-tracking, drawing a boundary between their spheres of influence in East Africa. The previous agreement, signed in 1886, established the border between the two empires to the east of Lake Victoria, Kenya, and Tanganyika, but the question of the territories to the west of the lake, Uganda and Tanganyika and Rwanda, had only been vaguely referred to. This uncertainty regarding the limits between the two empires, combined with the superficial geographical boundaries dating back to the records of explorer Henry Morton Stanley's map, became a sticky issue that caused a dispute between the chartered companies entrusted with the management of the African colonial possessions. By the time President Idi Amin invaded the Kagera salient, the 1,800 square kilometre corridor of land bestriding the Kagera River in the corridor between Rwanda and Lake Victoria in Tanzania, the seeds of suspicion and confusion planted by imperial powers had sprouted.
This particular issue of the Tanzanian border is as complicated as the issue of Mujingo Island. Because it was agreed that at the time of independence, all countries should respect the boundaries at the time of independence as it was. And there should not be any adjustment of borders or boundaries as it was prior to that, or between something that happened there. Because if we were to do that, there will be a continuous conflict amongst the African countries, which will never stop. For example, it's known historically that part of the eastern DRC covered almost half of northern Uganda. Eastern DRC covered up to Arua and beyond, up to about Ajumani on this side of the Nile. But eventually, by independence, the borders had been withdrawn to where it was. Part of Uganda was known to have gone into Kenya. But by independence, it is where it is now. Part of Uganda went deep into Tanzania prior to independence, much prior to independence. But by independence, it is where it is. Now, unfortunately, during these periods, people were born and grew up with these imaginations of where the border is at that particular time, and their parents or grandparents had this issue about where the borders are, and it stuck into their head, even after independence, that the old borders, and not the one at the time of independence, is the right border.
In the past, the Germans and the British fought twice over the control of this boundary. After Germany's defeat in the First World War and its African colonial territories placed under the League of Nations, the predecessor body of the United Nations, the Uganda Kingdom in 1929 appealed to the former to redraw the border to extend south of Kagera River as before. The British colonial government, which had been assigned responsibility over Tanganyika, thwarted the process. Now that they were firmly in control of the region, the colonialists regarded this as a non-contentious issue. However, the border crisis remained in place leading to Amin's annexation of Kagera in October 1978, which contributed to his downfall 5 months later. Even after the post-Amin era, the issue remained unresolved until June 2002, when the Ugandan and Tanzanian governments agreed to establish a joint technical committee to redemarcate the border. The border reaffirmation exercise was conducted in 2003. During the 2 years of negotiations for the border reaffirmation, Uganda attempted to contest the legitimacy of the border, which complicated matters until early 2003, when Kampala dropped its territorial claim. This paved way for reaffirmation exercise using the satellite-based GPS technology. To some extent, the border dispute may have been solved through the political lens. However, it left attendant problems, the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people now living in pitiable conditions.
We even have some people who live in Sangobe. Most of them are just there like refugees. Yet they are not well located as refugees, but they are languishing there. Some lost their relatives in Tanzania deep. And the law says that by then, when they were demarcating and reaffirming the border, I remember there was a sensitization exercise being carried by, the leaders from the two countries. They said, if you really want to remain in Tanzania, let's say you have been found in Tanzania, as long as you follow the real rules and regulations, you're free to stay. If you're found this side and you are in Tanzania, this side of Uganda, and if you happen to follow the rules and regulations, then you can stay. We have many Tanzanians who stay, who have their lands and what, they are living a happy life. But those ones who found the other side, nobody stayed. Nobody stayed. They were expelled.
According to Tanzania, for them, they are saying they were dealing with the people who migrated and stayed in Tanzania illegally. That's according to Tanzania. That they had so many people who were living in those areas of Kagera Basin, and they were there illegally. So they decided that they should send them away back to their original countries. But when you look at it, it is not true. Yes, there were some individuals, but this could not have led the whole majority of all those people to be displaced from Tanzania.
During the attack, Amin's soldiers removed several border beacons from the border, leaving the contested area open to a floodgate of settlers, especially pastoralists from Uganda and Rwanda, who destroyed more border markings. In 2003, the two governments further agreed to modalities of dealing with especially Ugandan settlers on the Tanzanian side. It was agreed that Ugandans whose property, including land and farmlands, touched both sides of the border would be uninterrupted as long as they followed the country's laws. Tanzanians in Uganda too would stay without any interference. A decade later, in 2013, the Tanzania's government, driven by national jingoism, mounted Operation Kimbuga, in which hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants were expelled. This came on the heels of residents' complaints in the Kagera district, which were presented to the then President, Jakaya Kikwete, about the large influx of immigrants from Rwanda, Burundi, and DRC in the area. At least 5,300 people later crossed into Uganda in 2013, settling in the Sango Bay area in Chotara district, and another 3,500 were relocated to nearby refuge camps. In Sango Bay, they have since been told to vacate the area to pave way for a large palm oil growing project. The Bugango County MP, Stephen Kagwaje, said Tanzania has largely been unfair to Ugandans.
In Tanzania, whether you reached in Tanzania about 1,000 times back or 1,000 years back, still they will tell you you are not a Tanzanian. You are not a Tanzanian and you are compelled to leave Tanzania. Many people really who are born in Tanzania, their grandfathers were born there, died from there, buried there. You know, those people have all the qualifications to be Tanzanians. But when they said, please, you must leave, and everyone left.
He said Uganda could not reciprocate in keeping up with the President Museveni's gospel of the East African integration.
Tanzania doesn't tolerate that. They don't behave like the way we behave. You know, here in Uganda, I like the way Uganda really does things. You know, for us, we are free. And that's why I always tell people that when we talk about East African cooperation, it is born here, raised here, participated, facilitated, exercised, implemented, and practiced well here in Uganda. But in other countries, there are some things which you can't really pray with.
Yasser Karugaba, the chairperson of the expelled communities living in Uganda, told NTV that Tanzanians started viewing them with suspicion in the aftermath of the RPF takeover in Kigali in the early 1990s.
That was the whole problem, and that is where the original problem came from. What they decided was that everyone who was looking like a Rwanda, as long as you have long nose, you are tall, surrender, all those kind of stuff, they decided that they should chase them away. And that is how we were affected.
Karugaba's pastoralist paternal great-grandfather migrated from the Greater Ankole Kingdom to northwestern Tanganyika in the 1920s. Karugaba's mother was a daughter of King Rumanyika of the Karagwe Kingdom. He was born and bred in Karagwe district, but to the Tanzanians, he's not one of them.
Imagine, everything that belonged to us was taken away from us. And we have been there for all this time, following it up through JPCs, these joint permanent commissions, but nothing has yielded fruit.
Why hasn't it yielded fruit?
I think it is because there is laxity. Still, there is no seriousness between these two countries.
His plight bears parallels with that of Abdallah Shigongo, a father of 9.
I appeal to both the Ugandan and Tanzanian leaders, especially President Samia Suluhu, to urgently intervene in this issue of Tanzanian nationals who were expelled from their homeland. I had a large extended family back home in Kagera, but now I'm not even allowed to cross back.
The 56-year-old's great-grandfather migrated from the northern before what is Uganda today. One day, in August 2020, Tanzanian authorities ejected him and his family on grounds of being aliens. He carried documents such as the national ID, voting card, local council letters, driving permit, but was told they were not insufficient to prove that he's Tanzanian.
There are many of us that were affected by this. Besides those who were expelled, others managed to pay their way out of expulsion, and they continue living in fear of being thrown out by the corrupt Tanzanian immigration officials. Removing illegal immigrants was in itself not a bad exercise, but immigration officers and police turned it into a feeding frenzy. There are many Rwandans, Burundians, and Congolese who managed to pay their way out against the expense of us Tanzanian citizens.
Ugandans too, whose land straddled both sides of the border and were supposed to be protected, were not spared.
The border reaffirmation exercise found us here. During sensitization, we were told that those whose property straddles both borders will not be affected as long as they continued to obey laws of that land. We were shocked one day when Tanzania started throwing us off their land and redistributing it to their citizens.
Initially, we were told by the Tanzanian government that it will not touch our property, but that changed. We asked government to urgently intervene in this issue because it has been long. What's more hurting is that we live side by side with the Tanzanians whose property lay on the Ugandan side, and nothing has been done to them.
My father's land was taken, the other side, and we accepted. And I remember the way we got that land, we got it lawfully. Even my dad had a land title, like other people, because we got that land through a real lawful procedure, and we got those titles from Kamukuzi. But later, when two governments decided to have another demarcation process, we found the biggest part of our land went to the other side of Tanzania.
The State Minister for International Relations, Okello told NTV that the pastoralists who wander across the borders have complicated the matter.
In this particular case, you're talking about people who are nomads, who move with the animals from one side or to the other side. Here we call them balalu in some places. But these are pastoralists who were moving in that region. And prior to independence, those who are in Uganda, when they went deep into Tanzania, to them that was part of Uganda at that time, before historically the borders came back to where it is. Now that was passed on to their grandparents, and then to their parents, and now they have inherited their parents' assets, and they still keep thinking that they have a right to where the border was all those years back.
He said both countries agreed to establish a commission to handle this issue affecting both sides, but both sides have been slow.
On the Tanzanian side, and our side also, part of it, there have been changes in the office bearers and service operators. To be on the ground, the facility to enable them to do their job has not been available, and hence I think it was postponed to September, when then we'll be in a position to be able to facilitate the full work and sponsorship of those responsible.
Following the 1884 Berlin Conference, where European powers set the rules for Africa's colonization, known as the Scramble and Petition of the Continent, then followed the drawing of boundaries negotiated through a series of agreements. The Uganda-Tanzania-Rwanda boundary was set in the Anglo-German agreements of 1890 and 1910. However, lacking precise data on topography, demography, and social-cultural patterns, colonial powers struggled during the demarcation process to ensure a degree of conformity between the new jurisdictions, and the existing distribution of political and cultural groups posed major problems not just in Uganda. Instead of using the River Kagera as the boundary between the British East Africa and German East Africa, the imperial powers relied on the first-degree parallel south, a cirque of latitude that is 1 degree south of the Earth's equatorial plane, commencing at the tripoint between Kenya, Tanzania and Uganda near the eastern shore of Lake Victoria to the west, following the parallel of River Kagera to its confluence with River Kakitumba on the Rwanda side. The main issue here, according to several history books, is the way in which the parallel is used for part of the land boundary rather than the River Kagera from its mouth to the tripoint with Uganda and Rwanda. The use of the straight line parallel created the Kagera Triangle and the Kagera Salient, which is the cruise of the Uganda-Tanzania border dispute. The Kagera Salient, a triangle of land and marshland straddling the area between the border and the river, was prior to the drawing the boundary by the British and Germans, constituted the boundary between Buganda and Ankole kingdoms and kingdoms of Kiziba and Karagwe in Tanganyika, while the Kagera Triangle in Uganda is occupied by the Wahaya community who fall on both sides of the border. The Welsh-American explorer and colonial administrator Henry Morton Stanley, writing in his 1890s memoirs In Darkest Africa, noted the absurdity of using the first parallel south latitude because it cut the Buganda kingdom into two halves. In other words, it was yet another case of dividing an ethnic group. On the other hand, Major Radcliffe Delm, one of the officials who supervised the demarcation of the Uganda-Tanzania border, according to accounts, specifically recommended that the boundary should follow the course of River Kagera from Lake Victoria to its confluence with the River Kagitumba at the Rwanda-Uganda border. Decades later, the border dispute remains a sticky one. Officials say the disputed area is about 300 feet wide, depending on which side of the border one comes from. In March 2015, President Museveni wrote to the then Tanzanian President Kikwete, raising the issue of the long-standing concerns raised by Ugandans whose land straddled both sides and whose property, including cattle, livestock and houses, was forcefully taken by Tanzanians. Mr. Museveni wrote, "I suggest that a proper inventory should be made of the claims with pertinent recommendations on the corrective measures taken." President Kikwete wrote back in July referring to an October 2007 correspondence to Kampala in which he raised the issue of the poorly marked border beacons which used the colonial first-degree parallel south but got no response. President Kikwete wrote, "These colonial borders are irrational and fragmented our people and our resources. However, at independence, we accepted the borders the way they are so as to avoid to being diverted by arguments about them." During a state visit to Tanzania in March 2016, the then Tanzanian President John Magufuli and President Museveni directed officials to meet and find a plan of action to concerns raised by border communities. Officials from both sides met later in April 2016 in Bukoba and Entebbe and made a series of recommendations which remain on paper 6 years later, while affected communities continue to live in anguish and despair.